Welcome to Between the Before and After, a podcast about the stories that shape us. I'm your host, Coach John McLernan, and each episode I bring you an inspiring guest with a moving story that shines a light on the power of the human spirit. Before we dive in, I want to let you know about two very important things. Number one, the stories shared here are often gritty, raw, and vulnerable, and very likely will include speaking about sensitive topics suited for a mature audience. Number two, this podcast is also broadcast live on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So on whatever platform you follow myself or Freedom Nutrition Coaching, you have the opportunity to participate in this discussion. You can comment on the live stream, and we encourage your participation both by commenting and asking questions. And so this podcast is about exploring the stories that take place between the before and after photos, not just in the realm of weight loss, but in all areas of life. So let's dive in. All right, I'm here with Tony from the UK. Tony Winyard has had quite an interesting journey. He's been a club DJ, traveling around the world, lived in more than 11 countries, visited another 80. That's a heck of a lot of traveling. He's also won an award as the best UK wedding DJ of the year, leading to him becoming an international speaker on value, customer service, and exceeding expectations. And but more recently, and I think part of the story that I'm really interested in diving into is his focus in recent years has been moving towards health and wellness more after the realization that almost all of his close relatives have actually died of cancer. And that's led him to diving deeper into nutrition, breathwork, sleep, and behavioral science to help people learn more about how they can improve their health, especially through the practice of habits. So welcome to the show, Tony.
Thank you, John. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Very good. Thank you.
Is it different for you to be on the other side of the mic? Because I know you do a lot of interviews as well.
Yeah, it's I mean, every now and then I'm a guest on someone else's podcast, but yeah, usually I'm the person interviewing. Yeah. So I always like to kind of warm up with my deck of 150 random questions here, and there's 6 categories. So I'll get you to choose a number between 1 and 6, and that'll determine which question we choose. 4.
Okay, so the category you have chosen is self. So that should be an interesting one.
Okay.
And the question is, let's see here. What qualities do you admire in yourself?
Actually, well, as this is about health, one thing that sometimes I amaze myself with my discipline when it comes to health, because when it comes to eating, like so nutrition and habits around sleep and sort of things along those lines, anything around health, I just have amazing discipline that I really surprise myself sometimes.
That's awesome. And I'm really glad you're able to share that, because sometimes we have a hard time acknowledging things that we do well. We live in this kind of the strange, maybe modern world where, social media is filled with all kinds of self-promotion. But when we actually ask someone to say, like, highlight something good about yourself, we often have some sort of discomfort around actually expressing something meaningful like that. So I appreciate that. So you spent quite a bit of time traveling as a DJ, and I think my impression is you're a fairly mild-mannered individual, and maybe you're quiet under the scenes, but there's a part of you that maybe I haven't yet uncovered. And so when did you start doing that? How old were you when you started out doing that?
Well, I started DJing when I was in my teens. I was probably about 13, 14. But when I first went abroad, I was 21. And then I was abroad for 12 years after that. Okay.
That seems like that could actually be a fairly taxing lifestyle. Like, it sounds amazing, like living abroad and DJing all this time. But I have to wonder if that's entirely sort of a healthy way of living in a sense. So what was your experience with that?
No, from a health perspective, no, there was nothing healthy about it whatsoever. From a fun perspective, it was amazing. And from seeing the world and everything apart from health, it was superb. But no, it was nothing healthy about it.
Yeah, and so because I imagine it involves like a lot of late nights and like going through the night and sleeping during the day, so the kind of the exact opposite of what you'd be wanting to do in terms of circadian rhythm. Now, may I? Oh, go ahead.
Even worse than that, in some of the clubs, well, most of the clubs, because this was in the 80s and the 90s, and there was no smoking bans then. And so it was just a wall of smoke. And even though I've never smoked in my life, every night I'd come home and I would reek of smoke.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. You're older than I thought, actually. I was if you're doing this in the 80s and the 90s, you got a few more years under your belt than I was anticipating. So maybe all of these different healthy changes that you've undertaken in the years since have reversed a little bit of the aging that might have happened when you were inhaling a whole bunch of secondhand smoke. So
it always seems to surprise people when they find out my age. It was actually my birthday a couple of days ago.
Oh, well, happy belated birthday.
And well, in 2 years' time, it will be the big one with an O on the end.
Okay.
And the number before the O will be a 6.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I'm 58. Yeah.
Yeah. You could have. I was expecting to hear 48.
Yeah, I don't know. I seem to have good genes, I guess.
Yeah, you kind of maybe struck it lucky there. So you traveled as a DJ and you did a lot of partying. And now, may I ask, you don't have to share anything you don't want to, but did that also involve use of like either alcohol or illicit substances or things like that? Was that a commonplace element on that scene?
It was. I was offered it all the time. I was offered drugs and alcohol every club I went to, almost every night. The drugs never appealed to me, and I've never liked the taste of alcohol. So I'm lucky in some ways that I didn't really get drunk much because I just don't like it. It wasn't because I was, because of health or anything else. It was just that I didn't like the taste of any alcohol. And the whole kind of drug scene just didn't really appeal to me.
Was there something about, because I know for myself, not that I've been offered a lot of drugs, but just the thought of like having sort of my consciousness altered and sort of and not feeling in control of myself was a fear that would have kept me away from doing that. I don't know if there's anything like that in play for you.
Yeah, I think it was when I was quite young. I mean, I did sort of experiment with some things like sort of marijuana and, grass.
Sure, yeah.
And I remember one of my friends took some pills. I think it was some kind of LSD, acid, something. I forget what it was. And he had a really bad trip. And when he described it to me, I just thought, man, that doesn't sound any fun to me at all. And then I was thinking, well, you never know what someone might put in that pill. You never can be sure. So it just didn't appeal to me ever. And even though I was being offered things like, I mean, there'd be many events and parties where there was literally silver trays going around with coke and all these various drugs that I could have just taken at any time. I don't know, it just never appealed to me.
Yeah, that's amazing. And kind of so you're in this party scene. You're breathing a whole bunch of smoke in that you might not. You're probably listening. Well, maybe you're not listening to so much loud music because you got your headphones on, and so your eardrums your hearing is not being absolutely destroyed. But
no, it was.
Oh, okay. Did because maybe back in the 80s and 90s people didn't take this. I don't want to say they didn't take it as seriously. Maybe there just wasn't as much awareness around it, or
exactly.
Yeah. And so, what's the thing that sticks out to the most in terms of your experience, like traveling around the world and being a DJ? Was there a particular experience that when you think back on that, you go like, "Wow, I can't believe that happened"?
Oh, there's so many. Trying to limit it to one or two. Wow. I mean, there's some incredible experiences. I mean, I almost got killed by the Indonesian mafia at one point. So that was quite an interesting story. I DJ'd for the richest man in the world, which was at the time, it was the Sultan of Brunei. I did a private party for him.
Okay.
I mean, there was
is this somehow is there a connection between that and the Indonesian mafia?
No, there's no connection between the two, but yeah.
Wow, that's quite something. So private party for the Sultan of Brunei, and did you get a chance to meet him and interact with him?
Yeah, well, I mean, he wasn't really interested in me, to be honest. He was I was just DJing at his party, But
yeah, that's awesome. Well, so now, but there's the thing that I kind of want to dive in, because this for me is like really interesting. I love the story kind of behind this, but I think maybe your time spent in this culture is part of what has led you to where you're at now and making some of these changes. What led you to deciding to step away from being a DJ and being in the club scene?
I just got tired of it. I mean, you kind of touched upon it earlier. I was doing it for so many years. And I kind of got tired of living out of a suitcase, because although it was a lot of fun traveling from place to place, and I was literally going every time I went to a new place, I'd usually be staying at each place for 4 months or 6 months.
Okay.
And I'd make lots of great friends. And then at the end of the contract, I'd have to leave everyone and start from scratch again in a new place. And it just became a bit kind of emotionally draining after a while.
Yeah, that was actually the first thing that came to mind. Is I imagine that to be emotionally exhausting, like having to like break human connections you've just started to form, and then try to forge new ones in an entirely new place, new culture, new country. And you said you've lived in 80, lived in 11 countries and visited more than 80 countries. And because I've lived in 7 countries and visited 45, and I thought, that was pretty good. My goal is to get to 100 countries at some point in time in my life. But is there something that you would have learned from these different countries, like something in particular that taught you living in all these different countries? Did you learn to speak any other languages as well?
Yeah, I used to speak fluent Indonesian. I used to speak pretty good Spanish, and smatterings of sort of Japanese and Norwegian and a few other languages.
Yeah. So, and here's a question that I get asked all the time that I find really a challenge to answer, but maybe you'll have an answer. Of those 80 countries, do you have a particular favorite that sticks out to you that you enjoyed the most?
Yeah, it was New Zealand. It wasn't a place that I worked in. It's just a place I visited, but I loved New Zealand. It's superb. Yeah.
Well, as someone who has Kiwi heritage and I'm married to an Aussie wife, I think New Zealand's an amazing and a beautiful country and it'd be a great place to retire. Minus like the volcanoes and earthquakes, particularly in the South Island.
Well, actually, I'm really into volcanoes, so that was another thing that I loved about it. And and the South Island was just stunningly beautiful. I cycled across the South Island.
Okay, yeah. And so, in terms of, so you would have like. You would have seen like a lot of incredible things, a lot of very interesting things. But is there anything about this sort of experience traveling and seeing all these other countries that bothered you, troubled you, or felt like a real sort of a challenge to cope with?
No, I've been lucky in that I seem to adapt to things very quickly. I every time I went to a new country, I just managed to fit in straight away. I don't know why I seem to have this quality, but I've had it my whole life. So no, never seemed like a struggle.
Yeah. Now you also spent some time being a stand-up comedian.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was when I was, I knew that I wanted to do more speaking, I was getting more and more opportunities to speak at events and conferences and seminars and so on. And I knew that every good speaker I'd ever seen in my life always used humor well. So I took a course to to learn how to do stand-up comedy. And then I made myself do the London open mic circuit. So I did 20 gigs around London for just to see if I was able to deliver comedy and to get people to laugh. And it wasn't because I wanted to become a comedian. I just wanted to be able to understand how to write humor and deliver humor for when I was speaking.
That's interesting. So what did you learn from that experience? Because I mean, I've just to preface this, like I did 1 or 2 sets as kind of a warm-up comedian. I used to host a couple of different comedy shows. And, even those little 1 to 2 minute stints where I got to kind of keep the crowd warm between performers, like I found like quite challenging.
Yeah, that's actually the MC's job is harder than a comedian's job.
Really? So yeah. Being an MC, you mean like being when you were DJing or?
Well, no, what you just mentioned, that's you were essentially the
okay,
MC.
Yeah, the MC, yeah.
The comedy MC is what's kind of holds the whole night together.
Yeah. Well, I also spent some time being a ring announcer in a pro wrestling circuit. So I had to learn to kind of work the crowd in that environment as well. Again, keeping the crowd warm between matches and learning when to sort of, bring them up and hype them down or that kind of thing. It was a really interesting, and learning how to project my voice and things like that. And so, I think this is a really neat, kind of a neat quality to have. Now, you had an experience, I think maybe it was about 9 years ago, where I think you lost an uncle to prostate cancer, if I have that right, and also your mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer.
Yeah, I mean, and the two things happened within a couple of days of each other. So yeah, my uncle, my mum's brother, as you say, passed away from prostate cancer, and then 2 days later, my mum was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And it was at that point I was having a discussion with one of my uncle's sons, so one of my cousins, and it never occurred to me before that every single one of my relatives that had died of cancer, like 100% of them. And wow. it led me on this. I just started reading tons and tons of books and listening to podcasts and just trying to get as much information as I could about cancer, because I was under the opinion, well, I'm definitely going to get cancer. That's how my thinking was at that point. I now know very differently. But yeah, I was positive. Well, it's just a matter of time until I get cancer.
Yeah, and it's not unusual to sort of come to that conclusion, to think, well, genetically it seems like there's a predisposition to that. Do you do you think that there's because we'll see on the flip side of that, there's people who might think they're never going to get cancer, but they end up getting cancer even though there's no family history of it. And so a lot of people might think there's sort of an element of like random bad luck to this, but I'm inclined to think, given your sort of research, understanding, experience, and what you teach now, that you see this differently. This isn't just an element of random bad luck.
Absolutely, it's epigenetics, and it's about your lifestyle. And I mean, there's various combinations. Genes obviously play a part.
Yes.
Then it's about how much processed food you eat, and how sedentary you are, and how much stress you take on. I mean, all of these things combine to how likely you are to, or how likely you aren't to get cancer.
Right. And you mentioned epigenetics. And for those who haven't heard the term before, it's kind of like being able to turn on and off a switch. So we have genetics, which would be like your hardware, that you're kind of equipped with. And then your epigenetics is kind of like the software programming, in a sense. I know it's a bit of a simplification, but maybe you wanted to share a little bit about, to share what epigenetics are for those who haven't heard the term before.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I mentioned, I'm clearly as genetically, I'm predisposed to get cancer because so many people in my family have got cancer. If I was living the lifestyle that I now realize that many in my family were living, and if I was eating a lot of processed food, I was very sedentary, I was getting a lot of stress, maybe I was overweight, all of those factors combined with the genes, I probably would get cancer. But because I don't have that type of lifestyle on the whole, it lessens the gene component of that.
Right. Yeah. Do you ever reflect on the time that you spent as like a club DJ and the sort of traveling the party circuit, and sort of that really taxing, and even if it was a lot of fun, it would also be like really kind of, I think, quite stressful and challenging. Do you think that history there might predispose you to, something like cancer or other types of chronic illness later in life?
Yeah, there's elements of, I mean, it wasn't stressful. It was a lot of fun. It was never stressful. But even the sleep, I used to get quite a lot of sleep because although I'd often be up till 5 or 6 in the morning, I'd just be asleep all day. And then so it wasn't, I actually got pretty good sleep, but yeah, I was subjected to a lot of secondhand smoke. I mean, like, especially in countries such as Indonesia, where they didn't really have proper filters on the cigarettes. So I was exposed to a lot of smoke.
Yeah. Yeah. And so along the way, in terms of the studies that you've done and this sort of self-learning that you've went, and I think you've also went through some certifications as well, this has kind of led you to completely rethinking your stance on cancer and things and products that we consume like meat and dairy. And I wonder if you could share a little bit more about what you mean by leading you to rethink your stance on these things.
Yeah, so because as I mentioned, I was convinced that I was going to get cancer. And the more I've learned about nutrition and genetics and sleep and stress and so on, I've just realized, yeah, it is more about your lifestyle rather than your genes. And so if you are eating more organic food, less processed food, if you are having more movement in your life, if you're getting pretty good sleep, all of these factors really reduce the chances of, I mean, it doesn't stop the chances, but by any means, but it very much reduces the chances.
Yeah, and what in particular about meat? And when you say meat, do you mean all sort of animal products? Or I know because some people zero in on red meat in particular and suggest that it could be linked to colon cancer, things like that. But what is about meat and dairy that you've sort of been rethinking as well?
No, I think meat is fine, but it's all about quantity, isn't it? And if you're eating it at every meal, that's not probably going to do you many favors. But if you're just eating good quality organic pasture, like farm raised meat, like grass fed meat, that's much better quality. It's not full of pesticides, and the cow's not full of antibiotics and so on. That's nowhere near as bad. Well, it's not that it's nowhere near as bad. It's much better for you than factory farm meat.
Yeah, and I mean, like, human beings have consumed meat for, I guess, probably since the beginning of human beings being on Earth, right? And but the difference is, I think, and you've highlighted here, is the health of the animals. I mean, for most of human history, it was just whatever you could hunt, and they would just be eating whatever they could eat as well. Yeah. And so the industrialization of the production of meat, and probably by extension we could say dairy as well, has led to the sort of health properties of it being maybe even potentially outweighed by the health of the animal that you consume.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you've also said, and we've kind of touched on this because as a DJ, you were still able to get quite a bit of sleep. And why do you make sleep the number one priority in your life?
I've realized that it affects so many other things. You know, so many other factors of health are dependent on good quality sleep. And you're more likely to, like, if you're not getting good quality sleep, you're more likely to suffer more from stress, and you're more likely to suffer from poor nutrition, like eating processed foods. And there's just so many other things that you're going to negatively affect by not having good sleep. And so although I've never really had problems with sleep, since I've realized the importance of it, I've just prioritized it a lot more. And I always make sure now I have a really good wind down routine. And even though now I'm no longer a full-time DJ, but I still DJ sometimes. And
Yeah.
even now when I DJ, and if I come home at say 2-3 o'clock in the morning, whereas before, after coming home from DJing, it would take me a long time to wind down, and I'd be probably looking at my phone and watching something on TV or whatever. I've now got a very different routine, and I basically come into my house with all the lights turned off. And I'm so used to being in the dark now. I can see really well in the dark. I go straight to my bed, and I get straight into the bed with it in pitch black. And so I'm not having that stimulation from the phone and from lighting and so on.
Yeah, and you think that's made a significant difference. And so, do you feel like there's something that like people are significantly unaware of, or not conscious of, or not thinking about, that could have a huge or a very significant impact on their health?
Yeah, I think sleep is probably one of the biggest. I mean, there's many things, obviously, depending on someone's lifestyle, but sleep is definitely one of the biggest because it does affect so many other aspects of health, and having a good wind down routine.
Yeah, and another one, because of this, again, your keen interest in cancer, and wanting to really wanting to set yourself up so that this is much less likely something that happens in your life. I think, is this part of the reason why you started diving into breath work as well?
Well, no, the breath work was because I had a history of asthma. So when I was a kid, I had asthma. And what was very interesting about the asthma was I had it from when I was probably about 11 years old for a few years. And then I noticed, well, I didn't notice it at the time, but when I went abroad, I didn't have asthma at all. In all those places I was living, and many of them were quite hot countries, I didn't suffer from asthma at all. And then when I came back to England, the asthma returned. And it wasn't immediately, I wasn't aware of it immediately. But then a few years ago, I realized, why is it that I didn't have asthma all that time I was living abroad? What was different there than here? And then I found out about Buteyko. I don't know if you've heard of Buteyko.
I haven't, no.
It was a Russian doctor in the 40s, 50s, 60s, developed this sort of breathing method, I suppose you could say. He was helping his patients. And I discovered about the Buteyko method, and I started practicing it. And for the first time in my life, I was able to relieve my asthma simply by natural breathing methods rather than using an inhaler, which I'd been using my whole life. And no doctor in my life had ever mentioned that there was an alternative to using an inhaler or some kind of steroids. You know?
Right. And so, because was your asthma triggered by things like, hay fever, seasonal allergies, or was it also brought on by activity, or?
It was more by sort of dust mites and allergies and so on.
Okay, so this Buteyko method, could you just in a nutshell, like share just a little bit about it to give people an idea of, and where they might, if they wanted to learn a bit more about this, because that's actually quite profound to say that there's alternatives to, say, inhalers and, say, corticosteroids to, can you use this, or maybe I should put it this way, can you use this in the time, like if you're having or feeling an asthma attack coming on, can you ward off or bring down an asthma attack?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends on how bad someone has asthma, but yeah, absolutely. So I simply do some breath holds, and so essentially what I'm doing is when we go to the gym, when we work out our muscles, our biceps, triceps, and so on. Well, most of us never actually try and strengthen our breathing muscles, which is our diaphragm and our intercostal muscles.
Right.
So essentially what the Buteyko method is doing, you could say, is strengthening our diaphragm and our intercostal muscles. And you're putting some stress on those muscles, which is always, a little bit of stress is a good thing. Too much stress is obviously not a good thing, but you're putting a little bit of stress on them and improving them. And you're just, there's something called a BOLT score, BOLT score, which is your body oxygen level test. And for many people, it will be under 20. So, and the way this works is, so if you have a stopwatch, if you get your phone or whatever, and you take a small breath in, and you do this for your nose, and then you take a small breath out. And as you breathe out, you start the stopwatch. And then as soon as you get an urge to breathe, then you stop the stopwatch and you take a breath in for your nose. If that breath you have to gasp, that means you've held it too long. It shouldn't. It's not. We're not trying to find out how long you can hold your breath. That's not what this is about. So the time that you should breathe in again, as soon as you feel any urge to breathe, whether that be you feel something in your chest or in your neck,
right,
or whatever, and then that measurement, that BOLT score, is kind of telling you how fit you are, how healthy your heart is in many ways. For many people, that will be under 20, which is a sign of dysfunctional breathing. And most people are dysfunctional as far as breathing is concerned.
Okay.
And so once you're above 20, so Buteyko method, there's a guy called Patrick McEwen, who is a doctor in Ireland, who he actually studied with Christian Buteyko, that doctor, that Russian doctor. He learned a lot more about the Buteyko method, and he wrote a book called The Oxygen Advantage. And I became an Oxygen Advantage instructor a few years ago, and I actually studied with Patrick McEwen.
Oh, that's phenomenal, because that book is actually in my Audible playlist. Cause I'm very interested in reading it, because I had interviewed a freediver a few episodes back, and he was sharing some similar things. Because you'd made a post on LinkedIn a while back, and I'd sort of queried you a bit on that, because I was curious, because you suggest that a lot of us are breathing incorrectly, and maybe we misunderstand oxygen and CO2 and the role that CO2 plays in it as well.
Yeah, most people overbreathe. We breathe in too much, and it sounds insane, because we think, well, no, we're never taught to breathe. Obviously, it's just something we do naturally our whole lives, but we typically take in too much oxygen, or more to the point, it's not that we take in too much oxygen, we exhale too much CO2. And the way that we do that is, if you're breathing through your mouth, you're definitely exhaling too much CO2. But even if you're breathing in through your nose, you can still exhale too much CO2. And the problem with that is there's a fine balance between how much CO2 and oxygen we have in our system. When we have the right balance, then we're able to get the right amount of oxygen into our lungs, into our cells rather. But when we exhale too much CO2, too much carbon dioxide, and then we have a much higher balance of oxygen, a higher percentage of oxygen, it's then harder, which seems perverse, it's harder for the body to actually release the oxygen into our cells where it's needed for energy and so on. Okay.
This is very, very interesting, because I think very few people think about this, and really it wasn't until I chatted with this gentleman Ray and yourself that got me really thinking about breathing. And Ray was the one who put me on. Ray's the freediver that I interviewed a couple episodes back, and he's the one that put me on to the Oxygen Advantage. And so now you work as a health coach, among other things. You also host a podcast yourself. What is it? And you focus a lot on developing habits. And you've also said that maybe happiness shouldn't be our number one ideal, or it's not necessarily the thing that we should be looking to pursue. Why do you feel like maybe we could say it's a mistake to pursue happiness or make that our number one priority?
Because if you're always trying to pursue happiness, it's something that you're never really going to obtain. Happiness is something that comes when you're just enjoying life rather than trying to pursue it. It's something that you can't really pursue. So if you're just aiming to have a good life and have fun with your friends and have great experiences, you'll probably be happy doing those things, because you're not deliberately aiming for happiness when you're doing those things.
I love that perspective, actually. It's the more we chase it, the less likely we are to actually achieve it as a state. Because I believe if we're pursuing it, we're kind of projecting it into a time in our future. But if that's our mindset, is that it's always being projected into the future, we're never getting to that point where happiness actually is.
Yeah, Exactly. There's what was that book? There was a book, Someday I'll, or I forgot, remember who wrote it, but it's about someday I'll be happy when the kids leave home, when I finish university, when I buy that car, when I get that promotion. I'll be happy when those things happen, but I'm not happy right now.
Yeah, yeah. And so you focus a lot on helping people cultivate healthy habits as well, and ultimately leading them to a healthy lifestyle. What do you think is the most important habit that somebody could maybe pursue or try to develop, and why is it so important to, almost could we say, like, to achievement? I think, like, why, we often set lofty goals, but would you say it's more important to cultivate habits than to set goals?
Yeah, definitely, because it's our habits that determine how well or how poorly we do in life, really. So the more in control you are of your habits, or the more you're able to automate the behaviors that you want and stop the behaviors that you don't want, and essentially automating behaviors is habits. So it is a matter of, if you're able to identify what behaviors you do want to cultivate in your life, and then when you're able to automate them, make them into habits, you're more likely to succeed in business, and also have better health and whatever it is that you're wanting to achieve.
Right, and that's interesting because you mentioned basically automating behaviors, and because I think, and because I also heard the word control in there, and I think a lot of people feel like they lack, say, willpower or self-control, but those who appear to have the best willpower, I think, are those who test it the fewest, or the least amount of times.
Yeah.
And we can do that by constructing basically habits and using habit practices to build out a lifestyle that just basically puts your health on autopilot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you don't want to be reliant on willpower, because it's a very finite property, and it comes and goes. So the less you have to rely on willpower, the better, really.
And so I wonder if in all of this, in the pursuit of a health, to, maybe we could say, to insulate yourself, or at least dramatically reduce the likelihood of you either getting cancer or getting terminal cancer, in all of this pursuit, what role do you, and maybe learning how to breathe as well. So I'm just trying to put these different elements together. What role do you feel like mindfulness has kind of played in all of this?
I think it's played quite a big part. I mean, I'm lucky that I'm quite a relaxed person, but I'm very laid back. There's nothing really upsets me. I don't take things personally anymore. I've realized now it's my choice whether to be upset at something or to take offense at something. I always have a choice in that. And since realizing that, I don't take offense at anything, because I realize most of the time that the things that people generally are offended by are things that they've chosen to be offended by. So I don't choose to take offense at something which clearly wasn't intended to upset me.
That's a very interesting perspective, because I wonder if, without trying to dive too deep into hot water here, but it's like we've almost created this culture of, like, wanting to be offended about things, be upset about things, to almost to create like this, like, self-righteousness, really. Yeah, I'm offended by that. So, but you also talk about focusing on character strength, and by cultivating or developing character strength, I think this ties into not necessarily letting things upset you or take offense. And maybe we could also connect another dot here and say, by choosing not to take offense and get angry at things that happen to you, that probably lowers your overall stress level and actually just improves the quality of your health and reduces the likelihood that you're going to encounter cancer.
Absolutely. And it also means you have more fun as well, because rather than being upset by something, you're able to, well, I find I'm more able to see the humor in something that maybe 10 years ago I might have got upset by, but now I will find the humor in it instead.
Do you feel that kind of as a culture, we've become more emotive, more like reactive and thinking impulsively rather than being able to take a step back? And if so, why do you think that is the case now?
Well, absolutely, we have. Why? I think there's probably, I couldn't tell you exactly why, but there's connections to the whole kind of phone, being addicted to our phones all the time, and there's probably something about that. I couldn't say exactly what it is. But yeah, I think we definitely are much more reactive. We have less focus now. We get stressed much more. Yeah, it's unfortunate, really.
Yeah, I don't know. Was it maybe Viktor Frankl who wrote in Man's Search for Meaning? I don't know if I'm having this right, but he wrote about the space between stimulus and response, like something happening to you and then being able to choose the reaction. And if I have it right, because he was obviously a victim, or he was held in a concentration camp, and in a concentration camp are the most sort of horrific human conditions. And yet in there, he was still able to live with a degree of liberty, because the one thing he had control over was his choice of how to respond or react to things. I don't know if I'm getting that right, but maybe you could share a little bit of what do you mean about the pause between stimulus and response here.
Well, and it's funny, actually, the pause between stimulus and response. Well, so the actual quote says the pause in the space between stimulus and response is our room for growth and freedom.
Okay.
And it's attributed to Viktor Frankl, but Viktor Frankl never actually said those words. He said something around that in Man's Search for Meaning. And in one of Stephen Covey's books, it wasn't actually The 7 Habits, it was one of his other books. He talks about Viktor Frankl saying that. And if you there's a website called quotesinvestigator.com, and they've really gone into this, and they've actually said no, Viktor Frankl never said those words, but whoever said it, it's a fantastic quote, and it's something that has made a massive difference to my life, because I regularly think about that quote. It doesn't matter who said it, I regularly think about that. And since I've worked on it, I've managed to lengthen the pause between the stimulus and the response, because I used to be the type of person, like most people are, who would respond automatically when something happens. So if I'm driving and someone tries to cut me up, I'd automatically get angry. Or next door's neighbor's dog is barking again, I'd automatically get angry. Now I don't let those things anger me. There's a pause between that stimulus and how I respond to it.
Is that something that comes with, or potentially comes with, age or experience, or is it something that could be consciously developed and cultivated as well?
I think it can definitely be cultivated, and if you just give it some thought, it doesn't necessarily come with age. I think maybe age is something that helps. But I mean, I've got a couple of friends. Actually, there's a guy who doesn't live too far from you, a guy called Matt, who I think Matt is in his 30s, and he's very much into this kind of way of thinking, this whole kind of philosophical way of thinking, and he works on that the same way I do, and I know he's certainly cultivated it.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I practice regularly is cold showers, actually, and part of it is to deliberately put myself into kind of a stressful or uncomfortable situation, and then see if I can regulate my response to that, actually through breathing, among other things. And so you're really working on this, and I think you might also say that forgiveness is a really important thing as well. And it's very interesting, because very often when we think about forgiveness, we think about like the big events in our life. Like I survived a trauma that was really quite significant. I had to move through forgiveness to get there. But do you think there's other elements, like being quick to forgive even when it's a small thing that would upset you?
Well, and also because forgiveness, too often we hold on to resentment and bitterness because we feel someone has wronged us. And by holding on to that bitterness, it doesn't hurt that person who we think wronged us. It hurts us. And so once you're able to realize that holding on to that bitterness is doing you no favors at all, and just to let that go is easy. It sounds easy. It's obviously not easy. But once you are able to do that, it helps you enormously. That was my experience anyway, because I had quite a bitter experience with the mother of my daughter, and we had to go to court a number of times and so on. And I was bitter for a while. And once I was able to let go of that, changed my life quite a lot.
Yeah, I love that. Now, if people, you've shared some really interesting things, and I think there's so many different things we've touched on in this conversation that would be really interesting to dive into deeper. But if people want to connect with you, where can they find you?
Well, my website is tonywinyard.com. And my Instagram is tony.winyard, and I think I'm on, there's only one other Tony Winyard in the world. He lives in New Zealand, funnily enough, but I was quicker than him, and so I've managed to get, if you look on any social media and you just put in Tony Winyard, I'm usually the person that comes up. So
That's absolutely fantastic. Well, you shared so much valuable wisdom here, and I've really appreciated that. And I wonder if you could maybe, if you were to sum up your philosophy in a nutshell, give people like one tangible takeaway to kind of close out the show. What is one thing that you would like to share with people?
Well, I think it is that just not reacting so quickly to things, and to stop and think about, did that person deliberately try to upset me, or am I just reading too much into this? And just by having that little pause and thinking about it, and most of the time people aren't deliberately trying to upset us. It's very rarely that I mean, obviously that does happen sometimes, but I think quite rarely.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Tony, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, and look forward to when we get a chance to chat again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Between the Before and After. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, share, subscribe, or leave a review, because that helps this podcast to reach and inspire more people. I love exploring the stories that take place between the before and after, the powerful experiences that shape who we become, and I love human potential. I love the possibilities that lie within us. So whatever you may be up against, I hope these stories inspire you, because if you're still here, your story's not done yet, so keep moving forward.
Anyone can come from any place of brokenness and destitution and build an amazing life.